Politics and courts. That's going to be our topic today on the McBride Attorneys Law Show. We want to dive into this battle between court systems and political intervention. And in reality, politics is something courts generally don't like to be involved in. But if you watch what happened back in 2000 with Bush versus Gore, and now in 2022 with the Trump litigation, courts are often brought into political issues. And there's a number of other political issues that are coming into the court system, such as the mask mandates, the emergency orders. And I wanted to spend a few minutes to talk about this because it's a recurring issue that keeps coming up. People keep talking about, can we get the courts to do political work for us? And generally, the answer is no. Courts do not want to do political work. And they have a special phrase for it. They call it a political question. If you don't like the way the politics are going, the court will often call it a political question, meaning it's something to be addressed in the political branches of the government, the executive and the legislature. The judiciary, the court system, to be viewed as being outside of the political realm. So often, if people are just not happy with the person they elected, how the person they elected is acting, what the legislature is doing, if people just don't like what elected officials are doing, the court will often call it a political question, which basically means they're telling you to build up the votes to vote that person out of office next time. But courts do have to get involved, and we've seen it, right? They occasionally do have to hear cases that have very, very political implications. From immigration to border security to all kinds of things to, civil rights cases. There are a lot of cases where it's very political topics and courts do have to get involved. So we're going to jump into that today. As always, this is very general. I'm talking at a high level. This is not attorney-client advice. This is just me talking and giving you some ideas about the law, giving you some points of inquiry. Attorney-client relationship would be something personal. This is just general ideas and tips. Consult your attorney for your specific situation. So jumping into this, one thing that's come up, for instance, is the Florida executive order to call an emergency. A lot of people want to call into question whether the governor can call an emergency and whether it's appropriate. And they point to different data and facts, right? And there's a lot of conflicting data and facts out there about what the status of the emergency is, right? Are we truly in an emergency? Are there deeper issues? And what are we doing to end the emergency, right? These are the things that people often ask. And they say, let's take the data to the court and have the court say the emergency's over. And generally what an argument like that is generally going to happen is the courts are going to give deference to the governor. They're going to say, hey, Governor, you've got to weigh all this data and all this facts and make a decision. And if you were duly elected by the people to weigh the data and the facts to make a decision, we, the court, are not going to get in the middle of it, unless it's a clear abuse of discretion, perhaps, or something where it's not clear that the governor is not acting in good faith. But generally, if the governor just makes a different decision than what you would like, and you're not happy with how he's making decisions, generally courts are going to say, hey, political question, vote the person out of office next time they come up for re-election. If you don't like the decision-making of your elected officials, the way the Republican system we have work here in the United States is supposed to happen is you vote the person out of office. You get rid of them. And the courts recognize that. They're loath to get involved in everybody's political problems. They don't want to be swaying things. If people elected a certain group and that certain group wants to run with their power in office, the court system is not there to apply the brakes. In theory, they are not there to change the direction. They're there to set the boundaries, right? A court system typically views itself more like a referee. What's in bounds, what's out of bounds, what's allowed, what's not allowed. And that's where a lot of the constitutional cases come from, right? They set the boundaries. In theory, the Constitution sets the limit of what can be done within the governmental system. And then the laws move policy within those limits, right? So you can only go within the boundaries of the law. So the Constitution. So the Constitution sets the outer bounds, and then the political parties can move within those boundaries. So the boundaries of police power, for instance, are very broad. When the U.S. Constitution was written, the states were given a lot of power. And so that puts very broad boundaries on what a governor can do. And then the legislature created here in Florida the ability for the governor to declare emergencies and gave him discretion in those cases. So the issue the court is going to generally say is this is an issue to talk to your legislature about. This is an issue to call your governor and say you don't like his decision making. They're not a situation where the court is going to say, hey, well, yeah, we agree. We don't kind of like what the governor's doing either. Let's stop that stuff. They're going to give the deference to the political will of the elected officials generally. When the elected official goes out of bounds and their actions become unconstitutional, let's say that a elected official wants to carry out illegal searches as part of border security, right? Then the court comes in and says, hey, out of bounds, you went too far, right? Again, enforcing the Constitution as a boundary, in theory, is what the court should be doing. And then they also have a role of understanding the language, interpreting the language, saying what it says, right? Because often language is passed. Maybe the police and the courts and the other people don't understand what the language means or don't understand a limit of language. That's a role of the court as well. Certainly does have some political implications because if they read it one way, it gives more rights. The other way, it gives less rights, etc. These are the types of things courts are typically going to get involved in. But if you don't like the way your politicians are behaving, the court's going to point back to the political question issue. And they're going to say, this is a question of politics, not a question of boundaries, not a question of law, right? So there's a distinction between law, which is what is written, and that's what the Constitution, you have written law, statutes, you have ordinances, a whole different variety of things that create the legal framework, what's allowed and what's not allowed in society. But then you have a whole realm of political, which is who's elected, what power do they have under law, how do they use that power? So that second part, who's elected, how they use their power, how that works, that's all the court's going to generally say, if you elected somebody, duly elected them, they get to do what they're allowed to do within law. We're not going to be the brakes. We're going to let them run and do what they want to do. Now, on the politics side, of course, the courts do have to enforce the framework, right? Do the elections get done correctly? Are the votes tallied correctly? And we saw that in Bush versus Gore, right? The system was, is it the hanging chads? Were they being counted properly? Were they being treated the same in all the counties? Was it a fair system that treated people equally? Those are open questions, right? And the court may take a position on those questions. But you can see, in theory, even though it affects who gets elected at the end of the process, the court's not actually, in theory, putting their thumb on a scale. They're not choosing who gets elected. They may weigh in on how somebody gets elected, but once that person is elected, or whatever the consequences of their rulings happen downstream, they let that happen. So courts are an uncertain route. And I hear from a great many people that they wish the court systems would do more to protect them. And in theory, the courts are not supposed to. That's not the way the system was designed. The courts are supposed to interpret the law. The law is written, the Constitution's written, the law is written. The court comes in and says constitutional, unconstitutional, and then let's read the law. If it's in the boundaries, if the law is within the boundaries of the Constitution, then let's read it and see what it means. It's really that simple, and it's not a complex deal, but a lot of people make it more complicated. Now, courts have been activists sometimes. They've found new readings of things. They've combined laws in unusual ways. That's why we as lawyers pay great attention to what the courts do, because they don't always agree, and they sometimes read things in what many people would call, unusual or funky ways. They come up with new analysis that we wouldn't expect. So we got to pay attention, but we have to understand that the court system is not the place for political answers. The court is supposed to just interpret the law. They're not supposed to sway politics. So if you're not happy with political decisions that your political leaders are making, call, write their office, put pressure on them. There's other avenues. But going to the court generally is outside the bounds of what most courts want to do. Not saying you won't find an activist judge that finds a way to side with you. It does happen. But in general, courts are going to try to stay away from that type of thing, defer from political questions, and focus on getting the law interpreted. All right, folks, this is McBride Attorneys Law Show. I hope you're subscribed. Ring the bell for notification. Drop me some comments, and I hope to see you all again soon for another show. And look forward to being there. And also, please share this with your friends if you're enjoying it. We'd love to get more people in the know about